Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Brazell, and I'm here to facilitate what should be a very interesting discussion about two new promising approaches to long COVID. One of them is a medical food called KetoCitra that was originally developed for polycystic kidney disease, but has now shown new promise in other areas. Dr. Thomas Weimbs of the University of California at Santa Barbara will tell us about a new trial of KetoCitra for long COVID patients. The other approach that we're going to explore is expressive arts therapy for long COVID. This process has proven effective for stress relief and may open new neural pathways to reduce brain fog, and we'll hear about that too. At this point, we're going to go to Jonathan Spira, the founder of the Long COVID Art Project, who's going to show us a new universal symbol for long COVID. Jonathan?
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank everyone for joining us today. I appreciate everyone's participation. When I founded the Center for Long COVID Research, as Bill mentioned, that was because I felt there was a void in good information that was authoritative for both COVID and long COVID patients. And I had recently then discovered I had long COVID. And this is another void. We use the spiky ball symbol that everyone uses for COVID, for long COVID frequently. But now we've designed a symbol specifically for long COVID, and we're unveiling it to the world, and it can be used by any group that, or any individual that is active in the long COVID area. The symbol is very simple. It uses some elements of the spiky ball, specifically fewer. But the key here is, while there are maybe 200 potential symptoms for long COVID, under the umbrella of long COVID, I chose 3, plus the top center is the central nervous system. So extra points if people want to guess what each one is, but just to quickly review, since this is an unveiling of the symbol, it's from 3 o'clock, it's fatigue. You can see the battery that is sorely in need of charging. From 6 o'clock, that is anxiety and depression, and the cloud above someone is the universal symbol for anxiety and depression. So we just borrowed from that. And at 9 o'clock is brain fog. So there you have it. That's the symbol that we will make, of course, in the coming days, copies available, an online symbol, and we've incorporated it into the Center for Long COVID Research logo, as well as what I'll be unveiling later, which we're very excited about, the Long COVID Art Project. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. And now we'd like to hear more about the new trial that has begun for long COVID patients and KetoCitra. So we're going to hear now from Professor Thomas Weimbs of the University of California at Santa Barbara, who is also the Chief Scientific Officer of Santa Barbara Nutrients, a company that Dr. Weimbs began in order to bring this product to market. Dr. Weimbs?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I appreciate it, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So as Bill mentioned, I've been at the University of California in Santa Barbara for something like 20 years or so. Before that, I was at the Cleveland Clinic, and I studied, in Germany with a PhD in biochemistry. My lab has been interested and focused on kidney disease for a long time, 20 plus years. And we have developed what's called a medical food for chronic kidney disease, and launched a company out of the university. The company is called Santa Barbara Nutrients. I'm one of the founders and currently the chief scientific officer. It so happens that the company was launched during COVID, and we realized early on that the ingredients in the same medical food would potentially be beneficial in COVID as well. It took a while, but finally a clinical trial is coming off the ground. And this is in collaboration with investigators at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, in particular with Dr. Nuria Pastor-Soler, Ken Hollows, and Dr. Rao. So they're really experts, internal medicine Dr. Rao has led as a long COVID clinic at USC. The trial is really essentially a pilot trial. As probably many people involved in long COVID know, is there's very few clinical trials going on right now, very little drug development going on. Many companies just haven't jumped on it at all. So it's frustrating for many patients. It's frustrating for clinicians because there are essentially no treatments really on the horizon right now. What we'll be looking at is essentially a pilot trial to investigate whether or not a so-called ketone called Beta-Hydroxybutyrate in conjunction with a low-carbohydrate diet may be beneficial in long COVID. And the trial is looking at to enroll 50 patients with long COVID, and this goes through the long COVID clinic at USC. Patients will be randomized into an intervention group of 25 subjects and a control group of 25. The intervention will receive instructions on a low carbohydrate diet, and I'll show you in a moment a couple more things about that. And in addition, they will get a medical food called KetoCitra, which is manufactured by Santa Barbara Nutrients. The control group will essentially have no change in diet, no KetoCitra, but will be offered the opportunity to cross over into the intervention group after completing the 30 days of control. So eventually, anyone that enrolls can be part of the intervention group as well. The outcomes of the trial are safety and feasibility to make sure that individuals with long COVID can adhere to a diet like this. They can adhere to taking a medical food every day, but we'll also be looking at metabolic health as well as, of course, long COVID symptoms. So this is not a very large trial. It's only a small pilot trial and really designed to look for what is called an efficacy signal, essentially to find out whether any patients might show an improvement in the intervention group, what those improvements look like, how they compare to the safety and feasibility, and the goal is, if there is this efficacy signal, design a larger trial after that. The intervention is meant to be very simple because, of course, patients with long COVID often have fatigue and brain fog, and will be difficult for them to make very drastic changes in their diet. Therefore, we opted to essentially only recommend simple steps to reduce the intake of added and natural sugars, to reduce the intake of starches, and compensate by increasing protein and healthy fat intake. There's an instruction video on a platform that I'm sure everybody is familiar with how to use it, just on YouTube. The instruction video is meant to can be watched as many times as one wants to, and ideally, household members will watch it as well and support the patient with long COVID by helping them implement these diet changes. And the second part concurrently is taking a medical food called KetoCitra. What is a medical food? A medical food is not a drug. It's not a supplement, but it is its own FDA regulated category. It was initially designed for individuals with chronic kidney disease, but it's also labeled for any condition that is controlled by what's called a ketogenic diet. It is manufactured by Santa Barbara Nutrients here in the US at high standards and would be taken twice a day as a drink. It's dissolved in water, and it delivers what is called exogenous beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone body that is normally produced by the liver during states of fasting. If somebody likes to get more information about the trial is listed on clinicaltrials.gov, which is a government website that registers clinical trials. So you can look it up here with this NCT number. The official title is Long COVID-19 Syndrome Lifestyle Intervention Study. As I mentioned, it's at the University of Southern California. The trial is actually funded by philanthropy. So Santa Barbara Nutrients supports it with free KetoCitra and some administrative support. But the trial is really funded by a family out of New York that have generously provided funding to USC to do the trial. Just to show anyone how, essentially go to the website here on clinicaltrials.gov, scroll down to the bottom and see who you can contact. The easiest would be to send an email to the principal investigator to find out how to enroll into this trial. So that's it for me right now.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Weimbs. I, by the way, am a KetoCitra user myself because I have polycystic kidney disease. I've been taking it twice a day for more than 2 years now, and I will say it's very easy to take. It's just like drinking 2 extra glasses of lemonade every day, so it's quite pleasant, and I look forward to it. Dr. Weimbs, you're now going to talk with Dr. Jonathan Spira, who is a long COVID patient and a KetoCitra user, and also founder of the Long COVID Research Project. Dr. Spira and Dr. Weimbs?
Yeah, Jonathan, welcome again. So we have been talking in the past about your journey with long COVID, and I just wanted to start there and essentially ask you how having long COVID impacted your life, but also your career, a bit as an illustration for what individuals with long COVID actually have to go through.
I think in hearing people's stories, and we already started to get some very interesting submissions to the Long COVID Art Project since the website opened in the past day or so. I think my story is somewhat representative because about the first year that I had all the symptoms, neither I nor any of my doctors thought I had long COVID. My first symptom that I was aware of was severe chronic persistent fatigue, where my body would shut down from 1 PM and not restart until 6 or 7. It wasn't sleep, because if it was sleep, then I would wake up feeling refreshed after. It was more a question of I felt worse after, but in the morning I seemed okay, and after that period I was somewhat functional. When I received my diagnosis of acute renal failure in August of the same year, where the fatigue started in late February, I tried to put 2 and 2 together and no one would have it. People would tell me there's no connection. They were all wrong, because the connection related to long COVID. I only found that out by virtue of my ophthalmologist sending me to the optometrist for a refraction test, and despite repeated testing and repeated attempts to make reading glasses that would help, nothing worked. And I realized at that point that it was my eyes, my muscles, that were tired, and they were constantly, I was of course tired differently every time. So I realized I had to do something more drastic, and I had been researching all the symptoms. My degrees are in history. My dissertation is religious freedom in the Habsburg hereditary lands during the Enlightenment. I had only been an armchair epidemiologist since December 2019, writing statistical reports about the pandemic because, well, there was nothing really else for me to write about. I became a medical researcher very quickly. The skill set transfer was not difficult. It was that tipped it over into the long COVID category. So then I had to, since my family also, although I don't have polycystic kidney disease, my mother's side of the family has it and it's a hereditary condition. So my mother's nephrologist helped me and stabilized the kidney. So knock wood, I think good for the next 50 or 100 years. The next thing, the big elephant in the room, was the severe persistent chronic fatigue, because I was losing almost half of my waking day and definitely half of my sunlit day. And that was not a tenable way of living. I thought of going back to Austria and telling the government, which has a much better social net than in the United States, hi, I'm here, I'm your problem now. I started to research, and I found a study that first, most of the things I found I couldn't take because they were contraindicated because of the renal issue. Obviously, you don't want to make it worse. And then I found a fairly obscure study where a doctor used duloxetine to help severe persistent fatigue with CFS patients. And it had about a 63 or 64% success rate, which was, compared to everything else that I couldn't take at all, I'm like, okay, that was the first therapy I began. Instant change. My body stopped shutting down. Few speed bumps in terms of the dosage. I had to decompound my medications as opposed to compounding them. And then you contacted me because by that point, I had founded the Center for Long COVID Research. You saw it on my LinkedIn. All of a sudden, I had these containers here. That was my second therapy. And that brought me from just not being knocked out to actually some degree of productivity. I felt immediately a change in the energy that I had. And there's a big difference. Up until that point, my decision tree was, do I cook a meal today or do I take a shower? It was very limited. I went from a day where I used to get up early, do work, take Snickers, the Wonder Dog, out for a nice hike, come back, do more work, go into the city to see a show on Broadway or off Broadway, And now I look at that, I'm like, that's 2 weeks worth of activities right there. I'm better greatly now. I'd say between the duloxetine, the KetoCitra, and also I then added a wakefulness drug, modafinil, which gives me a little bit of a boost. I'm trying to find something a little bit better that's not an amphetamine. I think I've seen a 65 to 70% improvement. If I don't have my KetoCitra, I notice it if I forget for some reason. And that's not a commercial. I'm not Lucy doing "It's so tasty" too on the sitcom. It's very important when you have long COVID to first of all know you have long COVID. And I have a feeling that there are a lot of people who are out there who probably have some symptoms and they don't even realize they have long COVID. And it's very hard to reach people. There's tremendous difficulty in this. It's one of the reasons we developed at the Center for Long COVID Research the peer-to-peer counseling phone line. I seem to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with these ideas. The peer-to-peer counseling phone line. Actually, the Center of Long COVID was also 3 o'clock in the morning, and then the Long COVID Art Project. So, a lot of work we have to do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan. I should remind everyone, nothing discussed here is medical advice, of course. Anyone interested in long COVID interventions should always work with their doctor. But to summarize, obviously, there has been a huge impact on your, the way you can lead your life. Before you found some ways of helping you, it impacted your career. And it sounds like you had to really struggle to even work with doctors and find doctors, find anything, any medication that works for you, almost by educating yourself by trial and error.
Not by myself. My GP, who's also a cardiologist, was with me all the way. With my nephrologist, I didn't move an inch, even with the KetoCitra, but I had to tell them, I had to show them the documentation and the studies. I had to inform them. They were fine with me doing the work.
Jonathan, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I want to make sure that we stay on time. And thank you, Dr. Weimbs and Jonathan, for that discussion. That was very, very interesting. Now we'd like to move to art as a long COVID therapy. The next speaker will be Elizabeth Preston of the Pomona Valley Medical Center, where Elizabeth is a master instructor in creative journal expressive arts. Elizabeth?
Thank you so much, Bill. It's really wonderful to be here. When I found that Jonathan had asked me to be the national spokesperson for the Long COVID Art Project, I was just really delighted. I live in Southern California, and I've been an artist for many, many years. But more importantly, I've worked for 22 years with people who were suffering from debilitating illnesses, but I have seen and learned the healing power of art. I've had 2.5 years working with long COVID patients, and I came in at the beginning knowing that there was a great need for emotional support so that some form of hope would come forward. At the time I came on, doctors were dismissive. We found that no one had, to this day, there is no treatment. There is no way to truly diagnose. But I'm trained in a process called creative journal expressive arts, and this process utilizes all forms of artistic expression. I belong to an organization called Project Insight, and our mission is to enhance the well-being of all individuals. So we use art therapeutically to build a community through the use of the creative journal expressive arts process. The advantages of using expressive arts for long COVID are that it allows a participant to think out of the box and to access the right hemisphere where they can re-access their feelings. And also it is a stress release. And there's no sense of time when we're doing art. And so consequently, expressive arts opens the doorway to looking at things in a different way. So many people have struggled with long COVID, but there are a segment of them who have found a new normal by using their creativity and finding a new meaning for life. And so consequently, we are inviting you to tell your story by communicating through visual arts, through painting, through photographs, photography, poetry, songwriting, because what we've learned that imagery and imagination have a profound effect on the body and on the immune system. And it appears that mental imagery can actually trigger the body's self-healing abilities. So we want to open the floodgates and allow you to show us your creative work, what you did as you were experiencing pain and loss and grief. And we want you to show us those pictures and images of agony that helped you get through this long journey, even though some of you are not yet on the other side. And so consequently, I think Marc Chagall put it beautifully. Despite the troubles of our world, in our life, there's a single color. As on an artist's palette, it provides the meaning of life and art. It's the color of love. So we want the whole world to appreciate and know the devastation of long COVID, but we also want to raise awareness so that the rest of the world understands this journey. And the rest of the world sees you, who have used your creativity, as champions of healing. And so you will see from our website that above all, you have an opportunity to submit your work, submit your expressions, and in so doing, at long last, we can prove that art saves lives.
Elizabeth, that was very beautiful. Thank you very, very much. And I'm sure an inspiration for many of those watching. Jonathan, do you want to say any more about the project that she was referencing?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the timing when my colleague Shirley Tesla discovered Elizabeth by finding a magazine article about what she was doing couldn't have been better, because I had been thinking about the idea of the Long COVID Art Project. I had even registered the domain name, and then Elizabeth came in and was explaining art therapy. I had been influenced by a trip not too long ago where in Norway, in Oslo, I saw in person Edvard Munch's painting The Scream. I saw that before I had long COVID, but in reflection, I tell people that if I were going to represent myself to the Long COVID project, and I will, although I probably will choose to play a very stormy sounding Beethoven sonata, I would use either my face over Munch's The Scream, or I would borrow from Macaulay Culkin when he screams in the first Home Alone movie.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, but we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Can you tell people about the project, please?
Yeah. Project is to express, as Elizabeth said, how you as a patient feel with long COVID, the abject devastation, I would say for me, the potential. One patient told me on the phone peer counseling line, but I said, "What's your symptom?" She said, "Financial ruin." All these things are so under-mentioned that this is the feeling we want to get out. And I chose to make this through any expressive art, whether it's dance, hopefully if the patient feels up to dancing, an essay, a poem, combination, anything. Show the world the face of long COVID. I took inspiration from the National AIDS Project, the National AIDS Quilt, which is online with a beautiful exhibition. I hope to come even somewhat close to that when we take what we're getting and make it online as well, so people can see this. But already the types of submissions we're getting are so moving. I was at tears reading one last night where the person wrote how tears represent how she feels. I didn't know how I was going to sleep. So I hope everybody who has long COVID can submit something to www.longcovidartproject.com and show your feelings. If you notice in the logo, we designed the logo to show the expressive arts. And I hope to get some joy out of this as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Much appreciated.
Play me off at the Oscars. Yes, I know.
If I had a band, I'd be playing it. Right now, Dr. Weimbs is going to interview two other patients who have been dealing with long COVID. One of them, Hal Abramson, is a retired foot surgeon and entrepreneur. The other, Jennifer Delazana, is also a writer. And we're very fortunate that Jennifer's speakers are now working so she can participate. Dr. Weimbs?
Thank you very much. Yeah, let's start with Dr. Abramson, if you would. Just wonder if you could, as an example, how a long COVID journey can look like, just describe how your journey looked like, from start and to essentially, maybe it's not finished yet, maybe it's still going on.
Yes, absolutely. So I actually got primary COVID back in March of 2020. It actually wound up sending me to the hospital. They found me unconscious and my O2 saturation was like 50. They wanted to intubate me at the time, which I refused, having known and watching on TV, everybody who was being intubated basically wasn't coming out of the hospital. So I refused. And I told them that they could give me IV, they could put me on high concentration O2, but absolutely I refused to be intubated. About a week later, I was released from the hospital. By the way, my symptoms were difficulty breathing, shortness of breath. One of my patients had coughed on me a couple of days earlier, not knowing really what was going on with COVID. I wound up getting headaches, tingling, burning, and numbness in my extremities. And so one day, I don't know, I just wound up on the floor and they wound up bringing me to the emergency room. When I was released, I found out that I had something that was called an NSTEMI, which is a non-ST elevated myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack. So COVID actually affected my heart. After that subsided and my symptoms went away, about 3 or 4 months later, I started developing severe weakness, lethargy. I didn't want to get up out of bed, something that completely, I've never been like that before. I was always very attentive. I had the brain fog. I couldn't concentrate. Normally I'd be up like super early in the morning looking at more entrepreneurial things going on. Couldn't do it. It was the weirdest thing. Like I couldn't get myself out of bed.
Sounds like you're really an example of someone who had a very severe acute form of COVID, which has also been found to associate with like a higher, chance of developing long COVID, but not always. Some people have very mild acute form of acute COVID. But in your case, it was fairly severe. You were hospitalized, and it might have been a good thing that you refused the intubation. We'll never know, of course. So how did you turn things around, essentially? Did you have support from anyone? Did you find a doctor specializing in this?
So I had support from my family. My wife was very supportive. Basically, she was trying to yank me out of bed, which she was successful at doing. I went to my primary care physician probably later in 2020, and he had no clue what I was talking about. He did not know what long COVID was. Nobody really understood what it was. And I was trying to explain to him, look, I'm clearly not the same person that I was before I had COVID. One of the things that he suggested, which I did do, was he put me on Adderall, which did seem to help quite a bit. So I've still been on it, and it does help with my concentrating and my focusing. And the other thing that he did suggest, which I also have been using, is low-dose lithium, which I think it has some sort of a positive effect. I have not tried the KetoCitra, but that is something that I'm definitely up to trying. I want to see how that makes things even better, but at least I can get out of bed. I can somewhat function during the day. And I wouldn't say I'm back to 100%, obviously. I'd say I'm 80 to 85%.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Abramson, for sharing your experience. And again, nothing discussed here is, of course, medical advice. So everyone, please check with your own doctor. Thank you, Hal. Let's move over to Jennifer Della-Zana. If you wouldn't mind, maybe describing your journey with long COVID.
Sure. It is completely different. I got COVID in January of 2021. I had just been, probably a month before, been vaccinated. It was extremely mild. One night I was sitting at dinner and I was like, gosh, I'm really tired. I had one cough, and then I'm like, I have to go lie down. I can't stay awake anymore. And the rest of the time there was a mild cough. I self-isolated. My 80-year-old father-in-law was staying with us, so I isolated in our basement. I worked through the whole thing. I had a cough, but it was pretty awful, I think, but I didn't even think of going to a doctor. I knew it was COVID. I tested positive, but it was just the overwhelming tiredness. And I would work at odd times, like Jonathan. I would wake up at 3 a.m. and I'd be like, okay, I can do some work. And then I would sleep all day. When it resolved, the brain fog sort of never went away. I get tired more easily. The problem is I also have fibromyalgia. So very similar symptoms, brain fog, tired. I was also going through menopause. So I actually joined the Johns Hopkins long COVID study. And every time I answer one of the surveys, I'm like, I don't know. I'm not sure if I have long COVID or I'm just getting old and I have fibromyalgia. So everything is just enhanced. The one weirdest thing is that the brain fog, besides the general brain fog, I can't remember names of people, names of places. I have the hardest time. I'll just start talking and then the name is gone. I'm a novelist. I forget the names of people in my books. It's very weird. So It's one of those cases where I do believe that I have long COVID. Strangely enough, I did not realize I have been having eye problems since then. I didn't realize till Jonathan spoke that maybe that's a symptom. Like, I do have bad eyes, but ever since COVID, I've been having the hardest time. I wear bifocal contacts. I wear reading glasses over them. Even that's not good sometimes. It's back and forth. So I think there are still things that I don't know that are wrong that may be connected to it. But it's one of those issues where I'm like, I don't know if I'm sick enough to really be part of this group, but I do believe I am part of this group.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this, Jennifer. And I'll hand it back over to Bill.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Hal. It was very moving, both what you guys have had to experience. At this point, we're going to move on into a Q&A. We have a question. The first question actually comes from one of our viewers today. And the question is, can you get long COVID? And I think, Jonathan Spiro, we'll go to you with this one. Can you get long COVID if you had an asymptomatic infection of COVID?
Good question. And the answer is yes. Having an asymptomatic infection is just as good for the long COVID gods as having a symptomatic infection. I was only able to surmise that I had an asymptomatic infection probably in mid-January 2021 before I was inoculated on Abraham Lincoln's birthday in February 2021. So in that, because Hal, we both contracted COVID before we were inoculated, before vaccines were out, really, the symptoms of long COVID can be far more severe. And I should add that Hal's wife is an occupational therapist. So when she dragged him out of bed, she really dragged him.
Thank you, Jonathan. Much appreciated. Dr. Weimbs, this one goes to you. Can you talk about how KetoCitra can affect inflammation? Inflammation obviously being one of the effects of COVID.
Great question. Just as you said, inflammation is probably the biggest problem in long COVID. Really, the mechanisms underlying long COVID are not understood. There's, a lot of research going on. Many parts of the immune system are activated, inappropriately activated, and that happens in many parts of the body. And that's probably the reason why there's so many different symptoms, and they can be very different from one patient to another. There's evidence for things like T cells and mast cells and different parts of the immune system being activated. And a general property of beta-hydroxybutyrate is that it is anti-inflammatory. So it's a potent anti-inflammatory compound that is actually naturally produced in the body, but it is only produced normally under conditions of fasting. So when we stop eating, our body switches over into a state called ketosis that is characterized by ketones, and the main ketone is this one called BHB or beta-hydroxybutyrate. And it's been coming out in a lot of recent research that a great benefit of things like ketogenic diets, for example, that push the body into ketosis without nutritional deficits. Great benefit is the potent anti-inflammatory effects, and ketogenic diets are now being investigated for many diseases in which inflammation is a driving factor. And in my lab at UCSB, we have essentially found that in the case of kidney disease, where also inflammation is a driving factor, that you don't have to use ketogenic diets, a very strict form of diet, but you can essentially shortcut and supplement with what's called the exogenous ketone beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is the main ingredient in KetoCitra, and that's how we essentially came up with the formulation. While we don't actually know the mechanisms why KetoCitra and the ingredients may be beneficial in long COVID, we think there's a very good chance it will be, and it might be very different from one patient to another. Some subgroups may benefit, others may not. So that's kind of part of the purpose of this trial, to find this out.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Weimbs. Elizabeth Preston, this question goes to you. This is from Mark Daly, a reporter at the Michigan Daily. His name is Daly, and he works at the Daily. And he wonders, how does Expressive Arts Therapy address key long COVID symptoms, such as fatigue and brain fog?
Thank you. It's a wonderful question, because having been involved with this from the ground floor, I was able to see the similarity between my cancer patients who experienced chemo brain brain and compare that to long COVID patients who were experiencing brain fog. And so with the Expressive Arts, I happen to be president of an organization called Project Insight, and we train and teach this method. And the reason we do is because, let's say, for instance, the truth of it is long COVID patients are filled with anger, disappointment. Their lives have been disrupted. We're even talking about a nurse who's been an ER nurse for 30 years who's had to retire. And so consequently, the Expressive Arts process gives our patients an opportunity to process their anger, their disappointment, and begin, in the words of James Jackson, who's a foremost expert who visited our class, it is important for us to begin adopting a new normal, and Creative Journal and Expressive Arts gives that because we access the right side of the brain through the process, and consequently people are able to begin once more feeling like they have some control over their lives.
That's great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Jonathan, this one's over to you. This is from the publication Art News. Who is eligible to submit works for the Long COVID Art Project, and will there be an exhibit or roadshow connected with this?
Great question, both. First, primarily, it is to ask long COVID patients to express how they feel, but it's very well known that family members who are caregivers have feelings of how it is to help the patient, their family member who has long COVID. There's a low double-digit percentage of long COVID patients who are bedridden. There's even a case in Pennsylvania of a 14-year-old who developed long COVID, who was a star athlete and became bedridden over a period of time, which is very scary. We welcome submissions from anyone who can express either the feelings about having long COVID or the feelings about having a friend or family member with long COVID. With respect to a roadshow, it would be a wonderful idea, but we long COVID patients, we don't really go out on the road too much. So we're going to maintain it online, but beautifully done. I keep referring to this as the first words I thought of before we finally came to the name Long COVID Project were mosaic and tapestry. So if you use that visualization, and also if you take a peek at the very, very incredible National AIDS Quilt exhibition online, which is so moving, that will answer that. And maybe Elizabeth has something to add to either of the questions.
I would think that the most important thing is, because our patients have such low energy and so forth, artistically they are able to express in a way that, because they've been dismissed, because they cannot put into words what they're experiencing. And that's the beauty of art, and especially the Expressive Arts method, is that we are able to express emotions of grief and loss and misunderstanding, even among family members. So I believe that the Long COVID Project gives an opportunity, even if you scribble, which is part of our process, even if you scribble and get all the anger out and you get all the disappointment out, that provides an image, and that image is your means of expressing your frustration and heartache. And that's what we're after.
I think that was beautifully expressed, but it made me think of something I hadn't thought of with respect to this. Despite my heavy family background in photography, there's a tagline from Kodak: a picture's worth 1,000 words. The pictures I've seen that have come in already through the project, and some of them are coming in from pediatric patients from a clinic in Michigan. There's a doctor there who's specializing, he's a cardiologist, but he's specializing in pediatric long COVID, are very, very moving, and they express a lot of words with the great simplicity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Dr. Weimbs, two quick questions for you, and then we'll finish this webinar. The first one of the questioners asked, how can I start a low-carb diet?
Great question. So first of all, what are carbs? What are carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are sugars and starches. So those are the ones that can spike the blood sugar. As we all know, the standard American diet, unfortunately, is extremely high in those carbohydrates. So something like 50 to 60% of the energy in a standard American diet comes from sugars and starches. years. This has led to an epidemic of metabolic disease, diabetes is rampant, obesity, and so on. And we probably all remember that in the early days of acute COVID, those people with poor metabolic health did the worst. So they had the worst complications from acute COVID and the highest mortality rates and so on. And that's one of the reasons why we think lowering carbohydrate intake is not only going to be beneficial in acute COVID, but also in long COVID. How to reduce it? It is a bit about education, learning where are carbohydrates present, how to identify it, how to read food labels, finding out where are the sugars listed on a food label, where the starches listed, which are not actually unfortunately listed. So it's a bit of a math involved there and a bit of education involved. But of course, sugar occurs as added sugars, in highly processed foods, in beverages, sodas and so on, but also in juices, fruit juices and so on. Starches occur in anything starchy, potatoes, bread, anything with grains, pizza, obviously things like that, rice and so on. So it's all about a little bit of education and essentially replacing these foods of foods that are much lower in carbohydrate, but one has to eat something. So one has to compensate by increasing the two other macronutrients, which are protein and fat. I think a very good educational video that explains all this, and patients can watch this over and over again.
Thank you, Dr. Weimbs. And once again, for those who may have missed it earlier, can you tell us again, how does one sign up for the USC clinical trial?
Yeah, so the best is, and I think we'll add a link to the notes. The best is to go to the clinicaltrials.gov website where the trial is registered and all the information is there, including the contact information of the principal investigator. Somebody would have to live in the greater Los Angeles, Southern California area to be able to come to the study site. So this is really for patients in Southern California. They should first contact the principal investigator, get information on how to come to the clinic and sign up for the trial.
Thank you so much. And we want to thank all the panelists today for some very moving stories that you guys have shared with us. We've learned a great deal about the effects of expressive arts therapy on long COVID and also KetoCitra on long COVID. I'm going to give the last word to Jonathan, who would like to thank some other folks.
I'd like to thank, first of all, everyone, both at UC Santa Barbara Nutrients, and the wonderful people who, for some reason, listened to me when I told them about this, who came to work at the Center for Long COVID. We're a patient-driven volunteer organization, and the team is it's so incredible. It brings tears to my eyes. We put together the center from nothing. We put together the Long COVID Art Project. With great cooperation and support from UC Santa Barbara and Santa Barbara Nutrients. This we collaborated on, but I'd like to really highlight the literally millions of long COVID patients across the globe. There are 17 million, at least in the United States. That's probably a great undercount, just as we had tremendous undercounts at the beginning with COVID. I, first of all, wish them all the best. I am not at all observant religious-wise, but there's one thing I want to express. Our sages teach us that saving one life is akin to saving the world. That is a philosophy I was schooled in, and that is possibly what drives me every morning to get up, no matter how I feel, and to try and help others with long COVID, because I have found some answers that they haven't yet, and we're all sharing what we found. And I think it makes for a wonderful mosaic of people helping each other. And to that, I wish there will be soon a reason that all of this doesn't need to exist, but I also, at the same time, sincerely doubt it. And from everyone, from our moderator, Bill, to our webinar wrangler, Emily Munsterman, Thomas Weimbs, our panelists, Hal, Jen, and it just thank you for this time. And thank you for supporting all the people with long, and Elizabeth, sorry, and Ellen, and my agent.
Okay. All right. The band is starting. Thank you. One last thing. I know I said I was going to give you the last word, but one person asked this, and it is important. If you are thinking about taking KetoCitra, please do check with your physician, of course, as always. Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated. Take care.